This reading is from the book of Esther, chapter 4, and starting at verse 5. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them to spare their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and the deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
Thank you, Sam. I'm just going to obviously hand over to Joy, but before I do, I'm just going to pray for you. Lord, we thank you for Joy. We thank you for all that she has done in your name over these years. We thank you, Lord, the way that you walk with us through these seasons of our life. And we thank you that you've brought her to us this morning so that we can hear more from her about the work and how this speaks into your witness. So, Lord, bless her as she speaks to us. And would you open our eyes and our ears to hear and see what you would have us hear, see, feel today. Bless us, we pray. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a real joy to be with you here in beautiful Nottinghamshire. I was here actually 2 weeks ago because I'm also linked with Watnell Road Baptist Church. So I was speaking there just 2 weeks ago. So yeah. It's a real privilege to share with you something of what we do in Nepal. I'm sent out by the Baptist Missionary Society. And I want to thank Alison and Paul for your work to encourage others to support the Baptist Missionary Society and the work that we do. And all of you who pray, that's really encouraging to us. I hope that video showed a little bit of what I actually do in Nepal. I work for an organization called Kiski Quip, and we work with teachers. And actually this month's Engage magazine has got an article which you can read all about our work in schools and teachers. So if you don't already receive it, free from BMS by post, there are some copies at the back and feel free to take one and you could sign up to get it. It's a really good magazine, but remembering my story of how I ended up in Nepal, read it with caution. Thank you, Sam, for reading from Esther. This verse that is very famous, I think, to all of us, probably very familiar, was a very important verse for me as I was getting ready to return to Nepal as a BMS volunteer in 2015. You may remember that an earthquake had just hit Nepal in 2015, and many of my teachers and my colleagues, my friends, suggested that I shouldn't go because it would be too dangerous for me, and perhaps the people wouldn't need me to be there. And so many people said that I began to doubt the wisdom of returning to Nepal just at that time myself. And this verse became very important to me at that time as confirmation that it was the right time for me to return to Nepal. I wasn't exactly sure what for, but I trusted that God had plans for me at such a time as this. It says, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." I think it's not just a motivational verse for Christians, but it's a reminder of how God puts us in situations and positions at certain times for his purposes. Although God isn't mentioned at all in the book of Esther, but there is clear evidence, isn't there, of his divine purpose. Esther was not there by accident. Not only was she in the right place at the right time, but she was already prepared for what she had to do. She'd been brought up well by Mordecai, her uncle. She had been chosen by the king to be the queen, and so she was in the right place at the right time. I've been with BMS in Nepal for 13 years. I've been with BMS for 14 years, and as Paul mentioned, I'm now supposed to retire. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm leaving Nepal and leaving BMS. And at end of service, I suppose it is natural to look back over the 14 years, and I can see how God in all of that has prepared me and placed me in situations at just the right time, even if it didn't seem that way at the time. In 1989, I first went to Nepal with the BMS to work as a teacher of missionary children with the United Mission to Nepal. In those days, it was common for mission workers to arrive in the country not knowing exactly which project or which place they would be sent to work. And that was the same for me. And so after I'd been in Nepal for a few weeks, I was asked to go to Okhaldunga. That's how you say it, Okhaldunga. Sounds almost Scottish or Welsh, doesn't it? Okhaldunga. It's in the east of Nepal, due south of Everest. And I was asked to go there for a week's orientation to see what it was like. I remember crying a lot that week. Okhaldunga was such a difficult place to live. The journey was hard. We had to walk for 5 hours very steeply up hills. That was if you managed to catch a plane, which went twice a week. Otherwise, it was a 5-day journey to reach the nearest road. It seemed so remote. I was to be the only single person in the project. There was no schoolroom, so I'd have to arrange for one to be built before I could start teaching. The relationships in the mission team were difficult. There were very few Christians in the church. The hospital had been destroyed by an earthquake, not the one in 2015, a previous earthquake. There were very few Christians in the church. The local Rai people distrusted foreigners, and the pastor of the church was in jail. As a timid 30-year-old, it seemed too much. And so I decided to ask for another placement. When I got back to Kathmandu, as expected, the education director of UMN called me into his office, and he said something like, "I know Okhaldunga is not an easy place to work, but are you willing to go there and teach the mission children?" And I opened my mouth, and I heard myself say, "Yes, I'll go." Where did that come from? Probably from God. I scraped the archives for this embarrassing photo. It was probably 1992, with some of the wonderful children that I taught. And of course, I settled into life in Okhaldunga, and I came to love the people and the place. I got my walking legs and came to understand the culture. Very few people in the village spoke English, and so, although I was teaching in English, I had to speak Nepali every day, and the limited vocabulary that I'd picked up in language school in Kathmandu grew, and I became more confident to speak Nepali. As well as teaching the children of missionaries, I taught in a local Nepali school, and I learnt how the Nepali school system worked and about the curriculum. I even had the opportunity to help to set up a school next to the hospital for the children of the hospital staff and the local village children to attend. I appointed and trained the first teachers and helped to organise the classrooms and the schedule. Little did I know that I would later be doing exactly that as a teacher trainer with Kiski Quip, which is where I've been working most recently. But God was using my time in that difficult place to prepare me for the rest of my adventure in Nepal. In the 1990s, as I said, Christians were widely persecuted. In Okhaldunga, we had to be very careful what we said and did. And it was sometimes frustrating not to be able to witness openly. The church was small, and we met hidden in a little room in the hospital because we were afraid of persecution. We heard of churches growing in other places, but in spite of our prayers and our witness, we didn't see the church grow as we wished. I had great expectations of what I would be doing in Nepal. I'd been sent by the BMS. I'd been commissioned by my church in Scotland, and I was supported by faithful folk like yourselves in churches around the UK. And sometimes I wondered if God was answering our prayers. What was I doing in Okhaldunga if God's kingdom wasn't growing? I remember sharing with a colleague and about my confusion, and as we were praying, suddenly realizing that God had taken me to Okhaldunga, not so much for what I could do for him and his kingdom, but for what he wanted to do in me. And often we have great ambitions of what we want to do in the church, perhaps here in the community in Nottingham. And those are great ways that we can serve the Lord through the church and in the community. And that is great to have those ambitions. But sometimes God uses those times and those acts of service to change us, to bring us closer to him, and to prepare us so that for what is to come in the future. A few years ago, I had the privilege of returning to Okhaldunga, and it was great to see that there is a new hospital. You can see it in the photo in the bottom right, those red buildings with the solar panels on the roof, and that the school is still providing a good education. That's the long yellow building in the top left, the long low building. But the biggest change to see was in the church. Now the believers meet twice a week because there are too many to all fit in the building at once on a Saturday and a Sunday. And they meet in a large building on top of the hill instead of being hidden down in the hospital. And it was only after I and most of the mission workers left Okhaldunga that the church began to grow. God waited for the son of the biggest antagonist of Christianity, the guy who persecuted anyone who expressed interest in coming to church or coming to faith. And his son went to work in the Middle East. Very common for Nepalis to work overseas. And while he was there, he met a Nepali believer who shared the gospel with him, and he came to faith. He went back to Okhaldunga, went to see his father, I think with trepidation, and told him that he'd become a believer. His father, as expected, said, "You are no longer my son. I don't want to see you again." But the son went to Kathmandu, went to Bible college for a year or two, met a beautiful Christian lady and got married. But he maintained the contact with his family in Okhaldunga, and he would go back to visit, even though his father initially wasn't very welcoming. When the buffalo was sick, he said, "I'll come and pray for the buffalo," and the buffalo got better. And slowly, through his witness, his father came to faith. What a miracle. It's like Paul, isn't it? The Saul and the Paul conversion. But through his faithful witness, his father came to faith. And when we were there, we were able to see a baptism. We'd never been allowed to go to a baptism before, and there were very few when we lived there. But this day, there were 12 people being baptized. And the first one to go into the river, in the pool that they'd made in the river, was the guy who persecuted. It was his mother, the last member of the family to come to faith. So God's timing is wonderful. We might have wished that God would hurry up and get on and do things quicker as we pray, but God's timing is perfect. And that is something that I've had to trust on numerous occasions in the years since then. During COVID, all our schools were closed and we couldn't do the work that we'd planned and prepared to do. We couldn't visit, we couldn't give training. And so that was frustrating. We had to wait, and we had to wait for God's timing for the schools to open again. I've been producing some phonics books for teachers to use, and the publisher had promised that they would be ready for the new school year in April, but they weren't. The publisher couldn't manage it, and he refused to answer my phone calls when I tried to contact him. I didn't know what was going on. But just before I left Nepal, I was able to meet with him a few times, and he's promised that they will be ready for the next school year. God's timing is perfect, but more importantly, the relationship with Equip, with myself and the publisher, has been restored, which is really important. For the past 5 years, I've been living and working in Baisi Sahar in the district of Lamjung. It's very beautiful. You can see the mountains from there. But life is not easy. It's very hot, it's very wet, and it's very cold. And as our schools are mainly on top of the hills around the town, walking to schools often presents a challenge. Here's me looking very tired as I've crossed a bridge on the way to one of our schools. There are very few foreigners living in Baisi Sahar. In fact, during COVID, I was the only white person in town, which led to lots of interesting conversations and friendships. But God had prepared me well, because I could speak the language, knew the culture, loved the food. I was able to become part of the local community very easily. When difficult times came, such as earthquakes and floods, the community needed each other, and I felt very supported by my neighbours and also able to support them. Many times over the last few years, I've come to realise that not only had God prepared me to live and thrive in such a community in Baisi Sahar, but that he had a reason and purpose for me to be there at that particular time. And I'd like to share some of those reasons with you today. During COVID, one of my neighbours, their son, had online classes. Not many schools managed it, but his did. He didn't have any Wi-Fi, they couldn't afford it in their house, so he came to study on my porch every day. His classes were from 6 in the morning until 10 in the morning, so I had to get up very early. But I got to know him well, and he loved to help me make cakes in my kitchen, and of course to eat them too. He and his little brother call me Auntie, and their young mum became a really good friend. One day, quite recently, they came back from church to find that Ayush's father had suddenly left them with no contact details, leaving huge debts and no money to pay for food and education. They have no idea, even now, where he is. In an instant, their stable life had disappeared, and they'd lost hope for the future. Ayush thought he'd have to leave school as they couldn't pay the fees, and he would need to earn money to support his family. Normally, at such times of difficulty, family members would step in and help. But Ayush's family have not even spoken to them since they became Christians and refused to have anything to do with them. So what options do they have? How could they survive? Together with the family, we spent many hours talking, crying, and praying. And we've managed to work out a solution to keep the boys in school so that my friend can start taking in sewing to raise a little money to feed the family. Her youngest son in the photo, the cheeky one, is only 2, but he's had to start school playgroup at such an early age so that she has time to earn a living. Not ideal, but the best that we could do in the circumstance. And there is even the possibility that they might make some money selling the cakes that they learnt to make in my kitchen for such a time as this. When I arrived in Lamjung, I decided that I would visit all of the 7 churches before I decided where I would worship. But on my first Saturday, church meets on a Saturday in Nepal, I went to a small church of around 30 members and felt so welcome and at home that I decided to stay there. The church had just got a new pastor, Isaac he's called, Isaac, and he has a real understanding of how to disciple new believers. He has a vision to lead a church of over 200 members. That's a big vision from 30. But we're now seeing the first steps of this happening, with 12 new believers being baptized recently, and one of our young people is completing theological training in Bible college to become our second pastor. Such a vision has practical implications. The building is too small and prone to flooding from the nearby river, so while I've been there, we've built a protective wall and an outdoor space, as you can see in the picture, with a kitchen and a meeting area for fellowship times. Food plays a large part in any church celebrations. I'm looking forward to lunch today. And it's been a privilege to support the pastor and his family by listening, reflecting with him, and praying, and to be part of this vibrant, believing church. The members and the pastor and his family of this little part of God's kingdom have become my family in Nepal and made living in Basi Sahar so much easier for such a time as this. My work with KISK Equip, Education Quality Improvement Programme, involves providing training and support for teachers in 15 village schools in the district of Lamjung. Most of my colleagues live in Kathmandu, and they travel out to the projects 3 or 4 times a year for training and follow-up in the schools. My training has mainly focused on early years education, so nursery and preschool teachers. I've done some critical thinking and problem-solving training, and my passion really is phonics. So I've done a training in teaching reading through phonics. Good for you. But I think my main contribution to the work of Equip has simply been being there, to be available in the schools to hear of the needs of teachers and students. As I live in the town, I can visit schools very frequently, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week if there's a need. And then to help Equip to work out how we can best support schools to provide the best education possible. You might remember of the time I heard that students in the hostel were too cold and they couldn't sleep because they didn't have blankets. And so I was able to pass on that need to our other mission workers in Kathmandu, and they responded with gifts of warm bedding. Another time we were able, with BMS donations, to set up 3 computer labs in some of our schools. And I could see when I visited the schools that these were great, beautifully set up. You saw them in the video. But the teachers didn't have the skills or the confidence to know how to use them themselves, never mind teaching. And so we were able to find some students in Kathmandu, Nepali students who were learning computing as their course, and they went for an internship to our schools. They lived there for a month, and they taught every day. And at the end of the month, the teachers and the students were much more confident. Because I was there, I could see the need, and we could do something about it. Or there was the time that a teacher told me that the biggest problem in her teaching was that her students fell asleep in the afternoon. And I said, why do they fall asleep? Well, they're so hungry, they can't study in the afternoon. And as I realized some of our students walk for 1 hour or even 2 hours to get to school in the morning, sometimes they maybe only have a cup of tea before they leave, and there's no food available in school, so they need to stay in school until 4 o'clock. So it's no wonder that they arrived hungry and then couldn't concentrate in the afternoon. So we started a school feeding program, which has made a huge difference to these children. Being there to hear of these difficulties meant that we could help. They say a picture tells 1,000 words, don't they? Tell me what you see. What do you see in this picture? Just shout it out. Sorry?
A girl in a sock.
Yeah. Yeah, a girl and a young boy, no socks, no shoes. Yeah. Very cute, looking happy. They both look very happy, yeah.
Rucksacks.
Rucksacks, great, yeah. Clothes? a wee bit shabby. Yeah, not a school uniform. Let me tell you the story behind this. One afternoon, I was leaving one of our partner schools, and I happened to meet these two cuties, as you say, walking home after their nursery class had finished. They were keen to chat, and they told me where they lived. And I knew that the village was at least 30 minutes, probably 40 or 50 minutes away, and they would walk. The children told me that they like school because the teachers are kind and they get to play with toys. We'd given toys for some more child-friendly teaching to go on to the nursery class. But the best thing they told me was the school lunch. Seeing that they had no shoes or school uniform, they'd just been given a bag as well, a school bag, someone noticed, by the bank. The local bank had donated school bags to all the nursery children. The bags were empty, actually, but they were very proud of their bags. But the next time I visited the school, I asked one of the teachers about them. I know that he has a heart for disadvantaged and marginalized students, and he told me that these students are from the Chepang community, which is a low-caste, traditionally nomadic people, but very poor. They commonly don't send their children to school. They're mainly subsistence farmers, and so children are needed to work on the land. But once that community heard that there was a school lunch provided, they started sending their children. And now there are 18 Chepang children in that school. And that's great that they're getting an education, and we're delighted with that. But the teacher said it's so difficult. They don't have uniforms, they don't have books or pencils. Although school is free in Nepal, parents have to pay for all of the pencils, notebooks, and textbooks. And so once we knew that that was a real need, Equip was able to provide a scholarship for 3 of the Chepang students. Although it's only 3, that actually impacts 3 whole families, so many more students are able to get food before they come to school and are able to go to school. And the next time I went to visit the school, I took pencils and notebooks so that the teacher could hand them out to those who didn't have. I happened to be in the right place at the right time. Equip, these are some of my colleagues that I work with, has been going through a time of reflection and evaluation. We've been working in schools in several areas, several projects around Nepal for over 15 years, and we're seeking to expand and change the way we work. Good news, I heard this week, we've now just started working with another 12 schools in a project in the far west in Rukum, which makes our total up to, I think, about 38 schools at the moment. It's been a good time for me to be part of the Equip team as we explore how we can make our work more effective. The government has brought in a new curriculum, which is really child-friendly, but it's very alien to teachers who are used to teaching by rote and repetition. And we've been considering in Equip how we can improve, make the training programs more effective, how to use our time, which is limited in projects, more wisely, and how we can identify champions who will really embrace change and can be leaders in their schools to take on the impetus even when we leave. Change is always difficult, isn't it? And teachers struggle to implement the new methods that they've learned in the training sessions. As I said, I'm passionate about phonics, so I would do a phonics training, and teachers would come from all the schools, and they would get very excited about phonics. But then the next week I would go to the school and visit, and they said, oh, it's too difficult, we can't do it, because none of the other teachers understand about phonics, and so if I teach it, they think I'm going crazy. We need some new resources. We need it to be put on the timetable. It's not on the timetable. When do I teach phonics? And we need our parents to understand so that when their children come home saying ba, 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 instead of ABC, they don't think that they're going crazy. So, hearing of that, we implemented parent seminars and whole school training for all of the teachers in the school into our program, and we provided new resources. So having trainers in the project is really important. People who can listen, hear of the need, and then do something about it. Let me tell you about two of the people I've worked with very closely in Equip, Krishna and Santona. Krishna, along with Dil, who's the head of Equip, is a BMS-supported mission partner. Some people have chosen, now that you're not supporting a mission worker like me, to support people like Krishna, and that is an option available to you also, that instead of supporting somebody going from the UK, you could support someone like Krishna, a local, who will continue the work. Krishna is the training coordinator, and he's an English teacher by background. And he often does blogs to put on the website or on YouTube for teachers to help with their pronunciation. And the latest was about teaching A for apple instead of A for apple, which really pleased me. His story is called 6 Hours to School, is actually on the BMS website, and it's a really good read. Have a look at it. It's really good. Santona is the English teacher trainer for Equip. She's committed and passionate, especially about girls' education. And although she had worked as an English teacher, she'd never heard of phonics. Neither had I until I returned from Nepal after my first term in 1996 and began teaching in the UK again. A phonics program called Jolly Phonics had just been introduced in schools, and I had to learn quickly how to use it. But I realized as I used it that it was very good at helping every child to read. And I also realized that it would be great to use in Nepali schools if someone had the time to rewrite it to make it more appropriate to the culture and context in Nepal. Some of it is very Western. Of course, during COVID, I couldn't go to schools. I was preparing training, and I had the time to rewrite the phonics program according to the Nepali context. Santona was a great help to make sure that the stories in the books would be easily understood by Nepali children, and she became interested in phonics too, especially once her son started to learn to read using phonics in his progressive school in Kathmandu. So we've since worked on many trainings together, and we've done follow-up visits together. Here she is carrying some of our reading resources to one of our schools. She's very strong, as well as being very able and competent to continue to train and support teachers in our schools. Isn't God's provision amazing to bring us both together at the right time and the right place to work on the phonics program? And that leads me to my last point. What of the future? What does for such a time as this mean for me as I leave Nepal? Can I say that it's God's time to move on? How do we know? There's always more that could be done. Ideally, perhaps I should have stayed until next year when the project ends in Lamjung and we will move on. I'm not sure what the future will look like. Perhaps I'll be able to continue to support the work of Equip from the UK or by visiting Nepal from time to time. I'm still writing resources for Equip to use in our schools. But I've handed over most of the things I've been doing to my colleagues. Santona and Krishna will ensure that phonics remains part of the program, and the secondary science teacher, Nirajan, bless him, has agreed to take over the nursery teachers training. It's not his gifting or his skill, but he's doing it. That is one of our urgent needs, is we need a teacher trainer with experience in early years classrooms who can take over that role. But I know that the work of Equip will not only continue, but will expand and flourish. The Equip team are committed, the work is in good hands, but more satisfying is knowing that it's in God's hands. And He will make it happen, because God's timing is perfect. He prepares us and then places us at a specific time and in a certain place for His purposes. We may not know what the future holds, but God does, for such a time as this. I'd love you to pray for the work of Equip to continue to enable students to reach their potential through excellent education in Lamjung, in Rukum, in Siraha, and the other projects around Nepal. For the smooth completion of the work in Lamjung schools, so as I say, we will finish there in March 2024. So we need to complete everything and also make sure that the work will continue even when we're not there. For myself, as I transitioned to life in the UK, someone said, "How is it being retired?" I'm not really sure. But I've now managed to get the keys of my house and I'm slowly moving in. So there's lots to do. And that all of us may choose to be part of God's plans in the time and situation that he has placed us. Thank you.